forces have been engaged in intensified clashes in southern Lebanon. The ongoing exchanges of fire has created a humanitarian emergency. The number of dead and wounded has spiraled. Over 300 people have been killed in Lebanon in just the past week. Since 8 October last year, the number of dead is now over 2,000, according to Lebanese Ministry of Health. Hundreds of those killed were civilians, including more than 100 children. Lebanese Armed Forces personnel have been killed, with 3 fatalities in the past week. Israeli soldiers have also been killed, including at least 12 on Lebanese territory since 1 October. Over 600 people have been displaced in Lebanon, 250,000 people since last Wednesday. The vast majority are women and children. A quarter of Lebanese territory has been placed under so-called evacuation orders issued by the Israel Defense Forces, affecting more than 100 villages and neighborhoods, with the IDF giving people as little as 2 hours' notice to vacate their homes, often in the middle of the night. Around 250,000 people, including Lebanese and Syrians, have fled into Syria. Tens of thousands more have departed through Beirut airport. Lebanon's health sector is under immense pressure. Many hospitals and centers closed following airstrikes hitting healthcare facilities and personnel. The flash appeal, launched last week, requests $425 million to assist 1 million people over the next 3 months. I urge member states to support this request, and I thank those of you who have already given or pledged aid. In northern Israel, the civilian population is also enduring repeated attacks from Hezbollah and other non-state armed groups in Lebanon and the region. Over 50 people have been killed and more than 60,000 have been displaced in Israel and the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights since last October, disrupting lives and livelihoods. The devastating conflict in Lebanon, coupled with intensified strikes in Syria and the raging violence in Gaza and the occupied West Bank, points to a region dangerously teetering on the brink of an all-out war. Madam President, our collective inability to stop the violence and stem the bloodshed is damning. Hezbollah and other non-state armed groups must stop firing rockets and missiles into Israel. We urge Israel to stop its bombardment of Lebanon and to withdraw its ground forces. The parties should seize the diplomatic options put on the table before them, not the weapons by their side. The United Nations welcomes the continued efforts of member states in this regard. As the Secretary General has warned, there is still time, but it is quickly running out. We must give diplomacy a chance now. The Special Coordinator for Lebanon, Janine Hesed-Pleshart, is engaging with all actors to stress the need for immediate de-escalation and a diplomatic solution. The parties must commit to a return to a cessation of hostilities and the full implementation of Security Council resolutions 1559 and 1701. The Lebanese state must have control over all weapons within its territory. We have seen what happens when it does not. The political impasse in Lebanon is approaching 2 years. At this time of crisis, I urge Lebanon's political leaders to take resolute steps towards addressing the vacuum. The state sovereignty and territorial integrity of both Lebanon and Israel must be respected. Obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law, must be upheld. In this regard, distinction must be made between civilians and fighters, and between civilian infrastructure and military objectives. Civilians and civilian infrastructure must not be targeted. Indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks must be avoided. Humanitarian personnel, medical workers, and journalists also must not be targeted. UN personnel, including the brave peacekeepers along the Blue Line and members of the UN family working under such dangerous conditions across Lebanon must be protected. We need to invest every effort to reverse this cycle of violence and bring Lebanon and Israel and the region back from the brink of catastrophe. Thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie Madame Di Carlo.
I thank Ms. De Carlo for her briefing. I now have the pleasure of giving the floor to Mr. Jean-Pierre Lacroix.
Merci, Madame la
Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President, members of the Security Council. As you just heard from the Secretary General Di Carlo, the situation in Lebanon and in the region is indeed increasingly alarming. The Israel Defense Forces ground operation in Lebanon that commenced on the 1st of October of this year, following a month-long sequence of exchange of fire across the Blue Line, are ongoing as intense air bombardment continues across the country. Much of southern Lebanon, UNIFIL's area of operation, is now uninhabited and increasingly uninhabitable. Israel's stated aim is the return of inhabitants to their northern communities after 1 year of fear, 1 year of displacement. Hezbollah continues to fire across the Blue Line and is now threatening major population centers, including Haifa and Tiberias in Israel, with increasingly high-caliber weapons. This is a clear demonstration of the presence of unauthorized armed personnel, assets and weapons south of the Litani River, in grave violation of Resolution 1701. Since the 23rd of September, with the launch of the Israel Defense Forces Operation Northern Arrows, UNIFIL has, as of 8th of October, detected 5,451 trajectories from south to north of the Blue Line and 610 air attacks by the Israeli Defense Forces. In this same period, UNIFIL has detected 1,385 trajectories from north to south. Notably, each trajectory may represent multiple projectiles, and UNIFIL cannot detect some projectiles, such as those fired by portable anti-tank launchers or light weapons. Since the 1st of October, there has been fierce clashes on the ground with at least 12 Israeli soldiers and scores of Hezbollah combatants reportedly killed. UNIFIL has observed Israeli incursions with infantry, Merkava tanks, and engineering vehicles at Marun al-Ras, Labune, and Yarun in Sector West, and near Kafakila, Mais al-Jabal, and Udaysa in Sector East. UNIFIL has not been able to observe all such activity, however, as I will explain later. This situation has put our peacekeepers at serious risk. Clashes in the Labune/Nakura area since the 8th of October have involved tank and small arms fire, airstrikes, Iron Dome interceptions, and multiple explosions. 2 peacekeepers were wounded when earlier today a UN post, OP-14, in UNIFIL's headquarters in Nakura was hit by tank fire. Close by, also early this morning, IDF soldiers fired on the UN position, UNP-131, from an opening in the fence made by the IDF the previous day during adjacent groundworks. Several vehicles and a communication system were damaged. Just yesterday, Israeli forces fired at cameras at the same UN position, and small arms fire hit another UN position, also near Labune, damaging lightning and a radio relay station. Until a year ago, the latter position served as a venue for UNIFIL's tripartite meetings. The UNIFIL force commander and head of mission has strongly protested these actions to the IDF. Shortly before commencing their ground operation, the Israeli Defense Forces had urged that UNIFIL peacekeepers vacate UN positions within 5 kilometers of the Blue Line, stating that this was for their safety and security. Our peacekeepers have remained in position in line with the mandate this Council has provided, while continuously reassessing the force's posture against prevailing risks. As a mitigating measure, UNIFIL had already strengthened the force protection of its positions near the Blue Line. In addition, with little movement and thus operational activity possible in the prevailing security conditions, UNIFIL had decided to reduce the footprint at the most affected UN position by 25%. By 6 October, UNIFIL had temporarily relocated 300 peacekeepers to larger bases within the area of operations, with the movement of another 200 planned depending on the prevailing security situation. The safety and security of peacekeepers is now increasingly in jeopardy. The actions outlined above go against the protections afforded to UN premises and personnel under international law. There is the further issue of military installations in the vicinity of UN positions. Previously, I have highlighted that Hezbollah activities in the vicinity of UN positions held the potential to draw return fire. Now we face a similar situation with the Israel Defense Forces installing positions directly adjacent to UN positions, a development that we strongly protest. On the 2nd of October, IDF Merkava tanks were positioned next to a UN position in the vicinity of Maroun al-Ras in Sector West, that is UN position 652, and an assembly area constructed immediately adjacent. On the 3rd of October, UNIFIL observed an IDF tank fire over this position, and on the 7th of October, 2 IDF-controlled explosive demolition nearby resulted in damage to the UN position perimeter bastions. By 8 October, the IDF had vacated their position while movement of IDF personnel and vehicles had been observed to continue on the adjacent road. In addition, on the 7th of October, firing by IDF tanks, which had been observed crossing the blue line near Alma al-Shahab in Sector West, damaged the external wall and bunker of a UN position, 131. The same day, minor damage was reported to a building and a UN vehicle in UNIFIL headquarters, Green Hill Camp. Also that same day, with an IDF incursion in the vicinity of Mais al-Jabal in Sector East, a UN vehicle inside a UN position was hit by indirect fire. It should be remembered that the ultimate responsibility for ensuring the safety and security of our peacekeepers lies with the actors on the ground. We have strongly protested the latest developments to the Israeli authorities and underlined the responsibility of the IDF to respect the protected status of UNIFIL and its personnel, including the inviolability of United Nations premises, and to take all necessary measures to ensure their safety and security, including to avoid positioning their troops in proximity to UNIFIL peacekeepers and premises. And finally, that this presence compromises the impartiality of UNIFIL and puts UNIFIL personnel and premises at risk of being impacted by any potential exchange of fire. Needless to say that these obligations apply to all actors on the ground. UNIFIL operational activities have virtually come to a halt since 23rd of September. Peacekeepers have been confined to their bases with significant periods of time in shelter. This severe impediment to the mission's freedom of movement within the area of operation has limited the mission's monitoring and reporting ability. The security environment has also presented challenges for the resupply of fuel, food, and water for UN positions. The deconfliction of UNIFIL logistics movements remains paramount. The mission is monitoring the security and sustainability of each of its positions, especially those on the blue line, adjusting accordingly. The security situation has impacted our civilian personnel as well, with almost all international civilian personnel relocated to Beirut or out of the country. The mission has made shelter available to those national staff who are not able to relocate from the area of operations. The UNIFIL head of mission and force commander, as designated official for the South Litani sector, is coordinating closely with the special coordinator for Lebanon, who is designated official for north of the Litani River, to ensure the safety and security of all United Nations personnel in Lebanon. The Lebanese Armed Forces has also come under fire, with 3 Lebanese soldiers killed since the 30th of September. 1 UNIFIL contractor was killed on the 2nd of September. Madam President, as noted by UHD Carlo, the heavy exchanges of fire have most tragically had the greatest impact on civilians on both sides, with many casualties and hundreds of thousands displaced. UNIFIL continues to support the Lebanese authorities in protecting civilians, facilitating humanitarian missions by the Lebanese Armed Forces and Lebanese Red Cross, and offering shelter to civilians at UN positions when possible. UNIFIL's liaison and coordination team has continued its close engagement with the Lebanese Armed Forces and Israeli Defense Forces, seeking to deconflict, facilitate humanitarian missions, and avoid miscalculations. The UNIFIL head of mission and force commander, in concert with the special coordinator, is actively engaging with the parties to urge an immediate de-escalation and a return to a cessation of hostilities. I echo the recent remarks of the Secretary General and of the special coordinator. There is no military solution to this crisis. We urge the parties to return immediately to a cessation of hostilities and to take real action towards full implementation of Security Council Resolution 1701. We stand ready to support all efforts towards a diplomatic solution. UNIFIL is mandated to support the implementation of Resolution 1701, but we must insist that it is for the parties themselves to implement the provision of this resolution. No one will implement them in lieu of the parties. To those member states contributing troops to UNIFIL, we extend our most sincere gratitude. The continued united commitment of the troop contributing countries, as well as the continued united support of this Council, is more important than ever. I express solidarity with and pride in the men and women of UNIFIL, now truly on the front lines in endeavoring to stabilize the Blue Line and beyond. I join the Secretary General in commending the Head of Mission and Force Commander of UNIFIL, General Haroldo Lázaro Sens, for his leadership in these critical times. Thank you.
Je remercie Monsieur Lacroix.
I thank Mr. Lacroix for his briefing. I will now give the floor to council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of France. Madam President, France called this meeting. I'd like to thank you for convening it, and I should also like to thank Ms. De Carlo and Mr. Lacroix for their briefings. The situation in Lebanon is extremely serious. It has not improved in the slightest since we last met. On the contrary, it's getting worse by the day. Hezbollah is continuing its attacks against Israel. Meanwhile, Israeli military operations in Lebanon are ongoing, including through land incursions in violation of Lebanese sovereignty. The civilian population is paying the price, a heavy price, for this. Over 1 million people have been displaced. France supports the work of the High Commissioner for Refugees, which is helping these people. It is imperative we recall that we uphold international humanitarian law. It applies to everybody. All regional players should exercise restraint. It's time for a de-escalation. We've condemned the attacks waged by Iran against Israel on the 1st of October. To put an end to this war, which is imperiling regional stability and also aggravating the political and humanitarian crisis in Lebanon, the way forward is clear. First and foremost, we need an immediate and lasting ceasefire in Lebanon. This is the appeal that France and the United States launched 2 weeks ago, and which a number of our partners have joined. It still stands, this appeal. Various voices in Lebanon have also relayed this call. We should secure, first and foremost, a cessation of hostilities to achieve a political settlement. The framework is clear. Full implementation of Resolution 1701. It has been recognized by both Lebanon and Israel as the framework for lasting stability all along the Blue Line and for security guarantees for both countries. Displaced persons should be able to go home in Israel and in Lebanon. It's vital that we restore Lebanon's sovereignty and territorial integrity. To address this urgent situation, on the 24th of October 2024, in Paris, France will be convening a ministerial conference. This initiative will bring together Lebanon's partner states, the UN, the EU, regional and international organizations, and civil society. The initiative has 3 objectives. On the political front, the goal is to restart efforts geared towards a diplomatic solution underpinned by Resolution 1701. The humanitarian dimension contains the objective of mobilizing the international community to meet the protection and emergency needs of the Lebanese populace. Last but not least, to guarantee Lebanon's sovereignty, we want heightened support for Lebanese institutions, in particular the Lebanese armed forces. Lastly, France would like to express its deep disquiet following fire which hit UNIFIL in Naqoura in the south of Lebanon. We condemn all attacks on UNIFIL's security. An explanation about the fire will be required. The protection of blue helmets is an obligation which is binding on all parties. France calls on the parties to abide by their obligations and to allow UNIFIL to continue implementing its mandate, including by fully respecting its freedom of movement. We'd like to reiterate our staunch support for UNIFIL, including its decision to maintain its positions near the Blue Line. We commend all UNIFIL personnel for their ongoing commitment and professionalism under these very taxing circumstances. In this context, the force's liaison mandate is all the more crucial if a de-escalation is to be achieved. I thank you. I thank the representative of France. I give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Madam President, I'd like to thank USG Rosemary DiCarlo and USG Jean-Pierre Lacroix for their briefings and their tireless efforts for peace and security. Lebanon is tragically experiencing similar means and methods of warfare employed in Gaza. Hospitals are being forced to close, millions are displaced, schools are destroyed, and countless lives are lost. Even more dangerous are the existence of the numerous other fronts in the region, each harboring the potential for a broader regional war, and even larger if these conflicts simultaneously combust in a vicious cycle. At this critical juncture, I'd like to make the following points. First, adherence to obligations under international humanitarian law and the protection of civilians are not negotiable. Particularly alarming are deadly attacks on medical personnel and units by Israel in Lebanon and recent cross-border strikes by Hezbollah appearing to target civilian areas in northern Israel. The targeting of medical resources and civilians are all flagrant violations of IHL. IHL obliges parties to an armed conflict to ensure that civilians receive satisfactory humanitarian conditions. In reality, the bare minimum of humanitarian conditions is being ignored in Gaza and now in Lebanon. Civilians must not be treated as mere pawns in the conflict. Second, the safety and security of UNIFIL peacekeepers cannot be compromised under any circumstances. UNIFIL plays a vital stabilizing role across the blue line, and in the current volatile environment, ensuring the safety of the brave peacekeepers is more crucial than ever. In this regard, we are gravely concerned about the incident this morning where 2 peacekeepers were injured after suffering direct tank fire by the IDF to an observation tower at UNIFIL's headquarters in Nakora. It also reminds us of the haunting Kana incident in 1996. We call for proactive and preventive measures to cease all future incursions near UN positions and any attacks on UN premises and personnel. Third, we call for serious and meaningful engagement among all actors to find diplomatic solutions. While the actions and rhetoric from various actors on the ground are belligerent, one common element emerges in their statement: the security of their own people. However, as history in the Levant has repeatedly shown, such security of any people cannot be achieved either in the short or long term through military means alone. We acknowledge the difficulties of pursuing diplomacy in the current environment, but dialogue, however elusive, is the only pathway to sustainable peace and the return of displaced families. In this regard, we deplore any attempt by regional powers to exploit the current abyss for their parochial interests, and we strongly support all efforts to reinvigorate diplomacy to reach a ceasefire. I thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie le...
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea, and I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
President, and I thank USG DiCarlo and USG Lacroix for their briefings. The situation in Lebanon is worsening by the day. Civilian casualties are mounting, and more than a quarter of the Lebanese population has been displaced. The humanitarian implications of the conflict are devastating and compounding an existing crisis in Lebanon, particularly for vulnerable groups who are unable to move or face considerable challenges in doing so. Israel must do everything possible to minimize civilian casualties. And Syrian refugees in Lebanon, already displaced from their homes, now face the choice of staying in the face of the conflict or facing persecution from Assad's regime if they return. For a year, Hezbollah have been launching missiles at northern Israel, forcing more than 60,000 Israelis to flee their homes. They must take responsibility for ending this cycle of violence rather than recklessly endangering the lives of Israelis and Lebanese alike. All parties must do everything possible to protect civilians and fully comply with international humanitarian law. The UK is committed to supporting the people of Lebanon, and we've announced an additional $19.5 million aid package to meet their immediate humanitarian needs. We are gravely concerned to hear that 2 UN peacekeepers have been injured by Israeli troops, and we wish them a speedy recovery. We reiterate that attacks on UN peacekeepers are unacceptable. All parties must take all necessary measures to protect UNIFIL personnel and premises and allow it to fulfill its mandate. President, we must not lose sight of the destabilizing role of Iran across the Middle East through their support to militias, including Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis. Iran must immediately halt its attacks on Israel and its support for its militias to prevent an already tragic humanitarian situation deteriorating further. A political solution consistent with Resolution 1701 is the only way to restore the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and stability of Lebanon. This requires an immediate ceasefire between Lebanon, Hezbollah, and Israel now, and immediate negotiations to re-establish security and stability for the people living on either side of the Israeli-Lebanon border. My Foreign Secretary has repeatedly and consistently called for an immediate ceasefire, and I repeat that call today. Diplomacy, not violence, is the way to achieve peace, stability, and security for Israel or Lebanon. Diplomacy, not violence, will bring wider regional stability. The risks of continued escalation and spillover into the wider region cannot be overstated. The UK will continue to strive tirelessly for a diplomatic solution to end this cycle of violence. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom. I give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank USG DiCarlo and USG Lacroix for their briefings on the deeply troubling and worsening situation in Lebanon, and welcome the participation of the representatives of Lebanon, Israel, and other member states in today's meeting. Madam President, the situation in Lebanon continues to worsen with each passing day, even as the wider Middle East becomes more volatile. We have noted that Israel continues to expand its military operations in Lebanon, with new divisions joining the ground invasion, while describing what was taking place as a limited operation or localized and targeted ground raids. Guyana is concerned about the relentless bombardment across the Lebanese territory, from its southern coastline to the heart of its capital, resulting in the killing of over 2,000 people and injury to more than 10,000, according to the Lebanese Ministry of Health. The Lebanese authorities have also reported that over 185,000 internally displaced people have been registered in shelters, and that from 23rd September to 9th of October, more than 400,000 Syrian and Lebanese citizens have fled to Syria. Meanwhile, airstrikes launched by Hezbollah are also responsible for the death, injury, and displacement of Israeli citizens. Even more worrying is the fact that the Prime Minister of Israel is now warning the Lebanese people that Lebanon could become the next Gaza, and urging them to, and I quote, "save Lebanon before it falls into the abyss of a long war that will lead to destruction and suffering like we see in Gaza," end of quote. This Council must spare no effort to avert a repeat of a Gaza-like scenario in Lebanon. Further, adding to this concern is the report emerging today of a plan by the Israeli Land Authority to seize the land of UNRWA's headquarters in Jerusalem. What this new disruption can mean for the millions of displaced Palestinians that depend on UNRWA for vital services like food, healthcare, and education is unbearable to even contemplate. The relentless intensification of attacks against this UN agency and its staff must stop. UNRWA is the backbone of the humanitarian operations in Gaza and often the primary source of aid in the region. Compromising its operations means putting the survival of millions of people at risk. As Guyana said yesterday, the UN and all peace-loving countries must not allow Israel to shutter UNRWA, and with it, life-saving support to millions of Palestinians. Let us act now to safeguard the purposes and the principles of the United Nations, principles which we all vow to hold sacred. Madam President, Guyana reiterates its call on all parties to this conflict to immediately cease hostilities and to uphold their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law, and in particular, the sacred obligation to ensure the protection of civilians. We must use every tool at our disposal to ensure full compliance with IHL and the protection of civilians, to ensure that the parties comply fully with Security Council Resolutions 1701 and 1559, and to find a diplomatic solution that ends this escalation of violence. A strategy of de-escalation through escalation will not only fail, but would almost guarantee a continuation of this very cycle of violence that we're seeing today. Madam President, Guyana once again appeals to all parties to guarantee the safety and security of UNIFIL personnel. They have operated over the last year under extremely difficult circumstances and are now being placed at risk of injury or even death. We must register our grave concern about recent developments close to the UN positions. The reports this morning of 2 UN peacekeepers being injured after an IDF Merkava tank fired its weapon toward an observation tower at UNIFIL headquarters in Nakora, directly hitting it, is deeply troubling. This recent attack also comes on the heels of earlier firing from IDF Merkava tanks, which damaged the external wall of the UN position, a UN bunker, and UN vehicles. This cannot be allowed to continue. UNIFIL's ability to safely execute its mandate, as authorized by this Council, is critical. We, the members of this Council, must continue to collectively insist upon the parties upholding their obligations with regard to peacekeeper safety and security, as well as international law. Madam President, as dismal as the situation appears, we cannot allow a sense of helplessness to lead us to hopelessness. Diplomacy provides us with the tools to halt the march towards a regional war and to eliminate a path for the restoration of peace for the people of Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, and across the Middle East. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana, and now I invite the representative of Ecuador to take the floor. Thank you. Thank you, Madam President. I'd like to thank Under-Secretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, Madam Rosemary DiCarlo, and Under-Secretary General for Peace Operations, Mr. Jean-Pierre Lacroix, for the information provided. My delegation is concerned as we see the worsening security situation in the Blue Line area and nearby positions, a direct result of reiterated violations of Resolutions 1701 and 1559. Ecuador reiterates its support, unrestricted support to UNIFIL, and we pay tribute to the peacekeeping forces doing their best to avoid a major escalation. The attack on the headquarters of UNIFIL in Nakura is very worrisome, that led to the wounding of 2 peacekeepers. Guaranteeing the security and protection of the men and women in UNIFIL, working in a most challenging environment for peacekeeping personnel in the world, is an obligation on the parties, as well as respecting the inviolability of UN premises. We join our voice with that of the Special Coordinator, Madame Janine Plachet, and General Lazzaro, requiring of the parties a definitive and urgent cessation of hostilities and a resumption of political dialogue within the framework of Resolution 1701. The Lebanese and Israeli populations on both sides of the Blue Line are suffering from the hostilities that have led to the death and displacement of forced displacement of thousands of people. The protection of civilians must be the priority in accordance with international humanitarian law. Likewise, United Nations staff and humanitarian workers and their partners must be protected pursuant to Resolution 2730 of this Security Council. The international community must renew its funding commitments to Lebanon in order to guarantee the continuity of humanitarian assistance operations. The lives of 1 million people depend upon its sustainability, including children, women, refugees, those with disabilities, and those in extreme situations of vulnerability. Madam President, Ecuador recognizes the imminent right for legitimate defense of member states of the United Nations, but always according to the terms enshrined in Article 51 of the Charter. The parties to this conflict have the obligation to fully respect the resolutions of the Security Council and therefore to respect the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Lebanon. We need to strengthen efforts in order to achieve a diplomatic solution to the situation on the Blue Line and in the Middle East. And today, more than ever before, the Lebanese government must recover effective control of the flow and distribution of weapons in accordance with the provisions of Resolution 1559. The diagnosis is clear. In order to de-escalate the conflict and avoid the cancer of violence continuing to spread throughout the region, what is required is that the parties exercise maximum restraint, as the Secretary-General Guterres said a few days ago. We must avoid at all costs another war, which would be disastrous for the peoples of the region. The instinct of humanity is towards peace and the negotiated resolution of conflict. That is what must prevail in order to avoid this crisis growing worse with immeasurable consequences. Thank you. I thank the representative of Ecuador, and I give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Madam President, I thank Switzerland Presidency for convening this briefing and the request of France. We extend our appreciation to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, Under Secretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, and Mr. Jean-Pierre Lacroix, Under Secretary General for Peace Operation, for their insights on this very worrying situation. Madam President, today's briefing, much like yesterday's on the situation in Gaza, paint a grim picture on the situation in Lebanon, one that equally demands our immediate and concerted, meaningful action. It is a matter of great concern to note that since adoption of Security Council Resolution 1701, limited progress has been made in its implementation. As a result, the situation in Lebanon is continuously deteriorating. Mozambique views with alarming concern the continued exchange of fire across the Blue Line between Hezbollah and Israel, which has intensified in recent days. We are witnessing an escalating spiral of violence worsened by attacks by Israel Defense Force deep in Lebanon, jeopardizing the safety of civilians on both sides, including UN personnel. The recent escalation between Hezbollah and other Lebanese and non-Lebanese militias and Israel has resulted in near daily cross-border exchange of fire. 1 million people were forced to evacuate due to the massive Israel bombing that are transforming Lebanon in a new Gaza, further heightening regional tensions. As a matter of reference, we would also like to mention that just 3 days ago, speaking on the 1-year anniversary of the Hamas-led attack on Israel, Hezbollah Deputy Secretary General pledged to continue operations, warning of further Israel's displacement and noting that before a ceasefire, there is no window for any discussion before a ceasefire. This shows an escalation of the conflict in the region at a time when Israel military claims to have targeted 190 Hezbollah sites in attacks across Lebanon, including renewed attacks in southern Beirut as well as Lebanon's eastern Bekaa region. As have fighting continues within UNIFIL's area of operations, with continued and intense exchange of fire reported, we urge the Security Council member states to urgently condemn these attacks and call the parties for an immediate ceasefire. The large-scale activity by Israel aircraft over southern Lebanon a few days ago, as well as Israel's commitment for the first time of a reserve division tasked with undertaking limited, localized, targeted operations in southern West Lebanon, cannot be tolerated as it further aggravates the conflict. Madam President, all reports indicate how deeply concerning is the situation on the ground has become. This requires all parties to cease all military operations on both sides of the blue line, including southwestern Beirut as well as Lebanon's eastern Bekaa region. We believe that the current events in Lebanon are deeply intertwined with the ongoing deadly war in Gaza, which has killed thousands of Palestinians to date and shows no sign of abating, triggering scenarios of immeasurable escalation. Madam President, Mozambique reiterates the need for de-escalation to prevent further instability and retaliatory actions, calling on the parties to protect civilians, including humanitarian workers, in line with the broader international humanitarian law obligations. We also urge all parties involved to strictly adhere to international law and Security Council resolutions, particularly Security Council Resolution 1701. There is an urgent need for diplomatic efforts to prevent further escalation and address the humanitarian crisis. The international community, therefore, must act swiftly to provide humanitarian aid and work towards a peaceful resolution. To conclude, Madam President, Mozambique reiterates its firm commitment to the principles of the United Nations Charter and stands ready to support all efforts towards peaceful resolution in the Middle East, including the long-standing Israel-Palestine conflict. This stance aligns with Mozambique's commitment to peace and stability as demonstrated by its own peace process throughout its history. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique, and I give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank France for having requested this emergency meeting. My thanks also go to USG DiCarlo and USG Lacroix for their briefings. Recent weeks have witnessed a sharp rise of tension between Lebanon and Israel. A few hours ago, the IDF attacked UNIFIL positions and an observation tower, causing injuries to UNIFIL personnel. China expresses grave concern and strong condemnation. UNIFIL carries out its peacekeeping tasks under the mandate emanating from the Security Council resolution. Any deliberate attack on peacekeepers is a serious violation of international humanitarian law and the Security Council Resolution 1701. Such acts must stop immediately. We demand that the incident be investigated and those responsible be held to account. Measures must be taken to prevent any reoccurrence. We reiterate that all parties to the conflict must effectively guarantee the safety and security of all UN personnel and assets. UNIFIL is no exception. President, the gravity of the current situation is clear. as is the right direction to de-escalate tensions. I would like to emphasize the following 3 points. First, since October last year, the series of destabilizing events that have taken place in the Middle East have resulted in more than 100,000 civilian casualties, leaving millions of people displaced. The cleanup work will take a decade or so. What's more, the trauma brought on by conflicts will be a lingering nightmare in the minds for generations to come. The Middle East cannot afford a full-scale war. The conflict cannot continue to expand. All parties must keep in mind the interest of maintaining regional peace and stability, deal with the current situation in a calm, rational, and responsible manner, and make sincere efforts towards breaking the cycle of violence. Second, achieving a ceasefire must be an overarching priority. We note that all parties in Lebanon have already made an unanimous call for immediate ceasefire. The Arab League has also issued an explicit appeal. It is clear who holds the key to ending this crisis. We urge Israel to set aside the obsession with the use of force, make the right political decision, stop violating Lebanon's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and end its adventurous behavior that could drag the region into a new catastrophe. Third, there is no time to lose for the Council to act. The vast majority member of the Council have long since reached a broad consensus on de-escalating the conflict, achieving a ceasefire to stop the violence, and stopping the diplomatic solution. We urge a certain country to stop its passive procrastination, protection, and connivance. It should act responsibly and play a constructive role in order to prevent further destabilization of the situation. I thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China, and I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Undersecretaries General Rosemary DiCarlo and Undersecretary General Jean-Pierre Lacroix for your briefings. Colleagues, the United States has been clear. A diplomatic solution between Israel and Lebanon along the Blue Line is the only path to restore lasting calm and allow residents in both Lebanon and Israel to return safely to their homes. Even as Israel has a right to protect its citizens from Hezbollah, which has fired thousands of missiles and rockets into Israel over the past year alone, it needs to minimize harm to civilians, particularly in the densely populated areas of Beirut. We are deeply concerned by reports of hundreds of Lebanese civilians killed in recent days, including children, medical workers, and an American citizen. And we reiterate our call on all parties to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure and to abide by their obligations under international law. For years, and in the face of so many tragedies, the Lebanese people have generously supported refugees from other neighboring states mired in conflict. Now, many of those who welcomed refugees, and indeed many of those refugees themselves, have had to leave their homes in search of safety in the north and even other countries. And so, it is critical that the international community return that generosity. Late last week, the United States announced $157 million in humanitarian assistance to support the needs of internally displaced persons and refugees inside Lebanon. And we encourage others to do their part as well, to support the UN flash appeal and the people of Lebanon who find themselves in need. The United States also lauds the more than 10,000 peacekeepers from more than 50 countries operating as part of the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, or UNIFIL, who are serving in dangerous circumstances to advance the cause of peace. On that note, we are deeply concerned by the reported injuries incurred by UN peacekeepers and are wishing them a speedy recovery. As we work to gather additional information, we have also been clear to all parties, including Israel, that we expect them to respect the safety and security of UNIFIL personnel and premises and avoid incidents that expose them to risk or harm, as well as to liaise with UN authorities to ensure UNIFIL can operate freely and in accordance with its mandate. Colleagues, let's remember how we got here. For far too long, Hezbollah threatened the security of both Israel and Lebanon. With financial and material support from Iran, Hezbollah built up its forces in plain sight, in blatant disregard of resolutions 1559 and 1701, and in direct threat to Lebanese sovereignty and political independence. And then, on October 8, 2023, Hezbollah opened a northern front against Israel in solidarity with Hamas. Not one of our governments would be idle in the face of rockets raining down on our citizens. Not one of our governments would allow terrorists to displace tens of thousands of people indefinitely. Both innocent Israelis and Lebanese have been forced to flee in pursuit of safety, leaving behind all that they've known. Again, we believe diplomacy is the only way to see those people return to their homes. And for the diplomatic resolution to be durable, the parties must fully implement Resolution 1701. That requires Hezbollah to withdraw from the border area and the Lebanese armed forces in UNIFIL to be deployed to the south. And it requires enforcing the arms embargo and taking steps to help ensure that Iran does not resupply what remains of its terrorist proxy. It also requires that Lebanon's political leaders set aside their differences and assemble a government that responds to the needs of the Lebanese people, including their desire for independence from foreign interference. In other words, the solution to this crisis is not a weaker Lebanon. It's a strong and truly sovereign Lebanon, protected by a legitimate security force, embodied in the Lebanese armed forces. And so, the international community must focus its efforts accordingly, helping strengthen Lebanese state institutions so that they can exercise effective control over Lebanon's territory. Key to that is condemning Iran for undermining Lebanon's sovereignty. And key to that is condemning Hezbollah for attacking Israel and once again putting its narrow interests ahead of the interests of the people of Lebanon, who did not start this war, but will bear the brunt of any extended conflict. Colleagues, as discussed last week, we must be prepared to impose severe costs on Iran for flouting this Council's resolutions and for supporting Hezbollah, which threatens peace and security. For our part, the United States will continue to work with our partners in the region and around the world to advance a diplomatic solution, one that provides real security to Israel and Lebanon and allows civilians on both sides of the blue line to return to their homes. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States, and I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Madam President, we extend our gratitude to USG DiCarlo and USG Lacroix for their briefings. The alarming deterioration of the situation in Lebanon, as highlighted in both briefings, underlines a dangerous escalation that places the lives of civilians and UN peacekeepers in grave jeopardy. We have previously warned that the military action of the Israeli occupying power will not be confined to Gaza and to the West Bank. Today, we reiterate our warning. Israeli aggression will not stop at Lebanon. The persistence of this invasion, the violation of Lebanon sovereignty and territorial integrity without serious reaction from the Security Council only emboldens further violations of international law and further instability in the whole region. So as long as Israel continues to enjoy impunity from our Council, it will perpetuate the cycle of violence employing the same egregious tactic of terror, mass destruction, and targeting of innocent civilian lives. These outrageous tactics that we have already witnessed in Gaza are now tragically applied in Lebanon. A few hours earlier, Israeli strikes hit residential building in central Beirut, killing 18 innocent civilians and injuring 92 people. When this council will assume its responsibilities of maintaining peace, international peace and security, when this council will impose sanctions on the Israeli authority for the atrocities and violations they are committing. Yes, the scope of this violation is staggering. In Lebanon, the Israeli army disregards all legal restraints, treating the country's sky, the country's sea, the country's lands as free rein for its aggression. And the figures speaks volume. Over 1 million people have been displaced within Lebanon, with hundreds of thousands more forced into neighboring Syria. Thousands have been killed or injured, and Lebanon's infrastructure lies in ruins. This is the conduct of an Israeli aggressor that views its security as dependent of the insecurity of others, and its strength as the deliberate weakening of its neighbors. Algeria reiterates our solidarity with our support of Lebanon in the face of this barbaric aggression. Madam President, Algeria highly values and commends the pivotal role of UNIFIL in safeguarding regional stability, especially in the face of this relentless aggression. The courage of our UN peacekeepers, their professionalism, and their steadfast presence, even in the wake of threat from the Israeli forces following the ground invasion, is commendable. We are deeply concerned about the establishment by the Israeli forces of a staging area adjacent to the UNIFIL position in the town of Marun al-Ras, and we condemn the Israeli forces for deliberate firing on 3 positions used by UNIFIL, injuring 2 of our peacekeepers. We remind the Israeli authorities of their obligation to ensure the safety and the security of UN personnel and property, and to respect the inviolability of UN premises at all times. Madam President, Algeria reaffirmed that the only path to ensuring stability in Lebanon and peace in the broader region is the full and immediate implementation of UN Security Resolution 1701. These include the deployment of the Lebanese army over all the Lebanese territory within internationally recognized borders. That means the complete withdrawal of Israeli forces from Lebanese lands. Madam President, the first step to reaching a comprehensive calm in the region is an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and in Lebanon. The true and enduring threat to the Middle East is and continue to be the Israeli occupation of Arab lands in Palestine, in Lebanon, in Syria. Failure to address these root causes and focusing merely on the symptoms will only ensure that the tragedy will repeat itself. This occupation must end now, before we are once again faced with an irreversible catastrophe. I thank you.
Merci, le représentant.
I thank the representative of Algeria, and I give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank USG DiCarlo and USG Lacroix for their briefings. During the past year, the exchanges of fire across the Blue Line have become a daily event. This is not consistent with the contents of the Resolution 1701, which I quote, calls for full cessation of hostilities based upon, in particular, the immediate cessation by Hezbollah of all attacks and the immediate cessation by Israel of all offensive military operations, end of quote. This Council has gathered many times over the past weeks calling for de-escalation. Yet instead, the attacks and hostilities have intensified. To react to the Hezbollah's persistent offensive, large-scale Israeli airstrikes in Lebanon, including Beirut, and IDF ground operations in Lebanon started. We continue to see more attacks and more casualties every day. This cycle of violence must stop now. We must avoid any further escalation that could potentially expand into the full-fledged war in the Middle East. We urge all parties to exercise the utmost restraint to avoid further conflict with global ramification. Madam President, Japan is seriously concerned about the severe humanitarian situation in Lebanon. More than 2,000 people have been killed, and thousands of others have been injured over the last year. Many civilians, including women and children, are among them. Hospitals and healthcare workers are under attack. All parties must recall their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law, and immediately take every measure to prevent civilian casualties. Moreover, over 1 million people in Lebanon have been forced to flee their homes, seeking shelter and food both inside and outside the country. Japan has contributed a total of over $290 million of humanitarian aid to Lebanon since 2012, and we are considering providing additional assistance in accordance with the people's needs under the current dire situation. Even in this difficult time, UNIFIL remains in Lebanon and continues to carry out its mandate. We are extremely alarmed by the report this morning that the 2 UNIFIL peacekeepers were injured after the IDF tank fired toward the observation tower at UNIFIL headquarters in Nakura. We fully respect UNIFIL's work and request all measures to be taken to ensure the safety and security of these peacekeepers. Madam President, the world is on the brink of a global crisis. Further escalation in the Middle East would bring devastating consequences worldwide, including an energy crisis. We must make every effort to avoid this. Thus, we call again for immediate ceasefire in Lebanon as well as in Gaza. We urge all regional players to act responsibly and with restraint to seize a dangerous cycle of attacks and retaliation. A diplomatic solution is the only way forward. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Japan, and I give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Madam President, I thank you for convening this meeting at the request of friends. I thank USG DiCarlo and USG Lacroix for their important briefings. Colleagues, the resounding and resolute call by our leaders in the general debate of the 79th session of United Nations General Assembly and repeated calls by this Council for a ceasefire and the need to exercise maximum restraint by Hezbollah and Israel have fallen on deaf ears. It is concerning to note that the conflict has entered a new phase of large-scale bombing activity by Israeli security forces over southern Lebanon, as well as reported ground operations in southwestern Lebanon. We also noted concern the recent statement by Hezbollah vowing to continue the fight against Israel until a ceasefire in Gaza is agreed, as they, that is Hezbollah, are prepared for a long battle. As we meet, heavy fighting continues across Lebanon, with intense exchanges reported across the country, including along the entire northwestern area of the Blue Line, now designated as a closed military zone, the fourth such zone established to date, and in the capital city, Beirut. Madam President, these attacks in both Lebanon and Israel have resulted in dramatic increase in deaths and displacement, with devastating consequences on the entire region. Lebanese health officials report a cumulative death toll of approximately 2,083 and 9,869 injuries since 8 October 2023, with 1,500 in just the past 2 weeks alone. It's also reported that attacks by Hezbollah and others south of the Blue Line have resulted in at least 49 Israeli deaths over the last year. These deaths include women, children, paramedics, and the fighters. Sierra Leone expresses grave concern for the safety of civilians and cautions parties to the conflict that the deliberate targeting of civilians and essential civilian infrastructure is a clear violation of international humanitarian law. We therefore urge the parties to the conflict to desist from indiscriminate bombing of communities and to protect civilians. We reiterate our call for both parties to the conflict to exercise maximum restraint and further stress the urgent need for immediate de-escalation and a ceasefire. Madam President, the humanitarian crisis is rapidly deteriorating to acute crisis levels. According to the WHO and UNICEF, 96 health facilities, including 4 hospitals, have been closed in southern Lebanon. We take note of reports that in Bint Jabil on Saturday, Israeli forces engaged Hezbollah targets that were adjacent to a hospital, and subsequent Israeli military actions allegedly prevented rescue teams from evacuating patients and medical personnel. We also note claims by Israeli authorities that Hezbollah fighters are using hospitals to launch attacks in defiance of the laws of armed conflict. We condemn all actions of using protected civilian infrastructure for military purposes and urge parties to respect the principles of distinction, proportionality, and necessity as enshrined in international humanitarian law. Sierra Leone urges all parties to comply with their obligations not to target protected persons and properties, including health centers, hospitals, and medical teams. Israel's extensive evacuation orders in the south of the country and in Beirut's southern suburbs have reportedly caused residents of at least 130 towns and villages across southern Lebanon to flee. Lebanese authorities estimate that more than 1 million people have been displaced. As of 2nd October, this IOM had identified 541,527 IDPs, of whom 173,800 are believed to reside in more than 900 collective shelters. As of Saturday, 289,245 Syrians and 93,033 Lebanese had crossed into Syria. And according to UNHCR, some 5,695 Lebanese have so far entered Iraq. Over 60,000 people remain displaced from northern Israel. Lebanese authorities have announced a further delay to the start of the public school year, which is now scheduled to begin on 4th November. To date, some 40% of the country's 1.25 million students have been displaced. Sierra Leone expresses deep concern over the fate of migrants, particularly migrant workers, and call on all actors to treat protected persons and those displaced by the fighting with dignity and without discrimination. Relevant UN agencies are urged to assist with addressing the plight of migrants caught up in the fighting. Sierra Leone commends member states that responded to the call to provide humanitarian assistance, including the United Arab Emirates, for providing an additional 250 tons of medical equipment and humanitarian supplies. Egypt for providing 22 tons of humanitarian aid, and Jordan for providing food aid to Lebanon in the last few days. We also welcome the announcement by the United States of an additional $157 million and by Sweden of an additional 83.5 million SEK in humanitarian assistance to Lebanon. The humanitarian support efforts by these and many other countries and organizations should be matched by a corresponding determination to end this conflict and the suffering of those caught in it. Madam President, Sierra Leone commends UNIFIL for coordinating support activities for the Lebanese armed forces, primarily for the movement of personnel, equipment, and vehicles, and a humanitarian mission coordinated for OCHA and World Vision Lebanon, transporting food and essential relief supplies from Beirut to displaced persons in Tyre. As a troop contributing country, we acknowledge that our peacekeepers in UNIFIL are serving in the most challenging environment today. It is reported that heavy fighting continues within UNIFIL's area of operations, causing damage to several UN positions, and as a result, 2 UN peacekeepers have been injured. Also of concern are continued Israeli military activities close to UNP, near Maroun Aras, and strikes in proximity to LAF personnel. We condemn acts of using peacekeepers as human shields and all acts that endanger the lives of peacekeepers. We all urge parties to ensure the safety and security of United Nations personnel and to respect the inviolability of United Nations premises. Sierra Leone joined the Secretary General in expressing our gratitude and admiration to our peacekeepers. We raise our support for UNIFIL to continue to carry out its mandates to the extent possible. Sierra Leone further calls on the parties to use diplomatic channels, including United Nations good offices, to avoid further escalation and risking a war that will include actors outside of the region. This Council must now stand united in calling for the full implementation of all relevant Security Council resolutions, including Resolution 1701 and 1559. All sides must agree to a ceasefire as a precursor to the resettlement of displaced residents in the south of Lebanon and north of Israel. In conclusion, Madam President, Sierra Leone continues to call for the parties to consider the global implications of their actions and recommit to a cessation of hostilities. We urge the Security Council to act decisively to halt the violence, enforce a ceasefire, the release of hostages and prisoners, facilitation of access to humanitarian aid, ensure accountability, and work towards a just and lasting solution that respects the rights of all persons. Let us end the occupation of Palestine, and as the International Court of Justice has called for, implement the two-state solution and choose a future of peace, stability, and dignity for both Palestinians and Israelis and the entire region. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone. I give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Madam President, I also want to thank Undersecretary General De Carlo and Undersecretary General Recroix for their briefing. It has been a year of escalating exchanges of fire across the blue line. Against civilians, majority of them women and children, are paying the highest price. This spiral of retaliations and intensifications has escalated into a military confrontation with a devastating impact on the whole of Lebanon. and with the threat of spreading across the wider region. Slovenia repeats its call for an immediate cessation of hostilities and an urgent regional ceasefire. We call on Hezbollah to immediately cease its attacks on Israel. We call on Israel to revoke their military operation in Lebanon. Sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Lebanon must be fully respected by all. We are at the edge of an all-out regional war. As a first step, it is more crucial than ever that countries with influence over actors and countries in the region exert that influence to ensure restraint. As a second step, this influence must be used to de-escalation and commitment to peace and stability, including through the full implementation of Resolution 1701. Slovenia underlines the need to ensure and respect the safety and security of UNIFIL. UNIFIL's activities have been significantly affected by military confrontation in Lebanon. UNIFIL's presence on the ground remains a stabilizing factor. We remind all the parties of their obligation to ensure safety and security of peacekeepers and full respect of inviolability of UN premises. We condemn all attacks on UN peacekeepers, including today's Israeli firing on UNIFIL headquarters and other positions. We wish speedy recovery to the injured peacekeepers. We take this opportunity to express our deep appreciation to the peacekeepers and to the troop contributing countries. Slovenia calls on all parties to respect international law, particularly international humanitarian law and human rights law. We strongly condemn the high number of civilian victims, including deaths of humanitarian and healthcare workers. We are dismayed by the scale of displacement, extensive damage to civilian infrastructure, and an alarming rise in humanitarian needs across the country. We stand by people of Lebanon as they face another humanitarian challenge on top of economic, social, and political instability. More than a year has now passed since the start of the war in Gaza, which showed us all how violence, if not stopped, drives further violence to the point of unprecedented catastrophe. With bombing, destruction, and displacement, Lebanon is becoming the next Gaza. We are profoundly alarmed by the parallels we see on the ground, including the statements of Israeli leaders. The Council should not follow in the same footsteps as with Gaza. We have to act. Political, not military solutions are required. Colleagues, the only path out of this spiral is the path of diplomacy. This path is never paved with missiles, rockets, ground raids, or civilian suffering. It is paved with courage of leaders willing to make difficult but decisive decisions for the benefit of their nations. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia and give the floor to the representative of Malta.
President, and thank you USGs DiCarlo and Lacroix for your briefings. This week marks 1 year since nearly daily exchanges of fire commenced across the Blue Line, in which far too many lives have been lost, uprooted, and devastated. Civilians on both sides of the Blue Line are left wanting for security and stability. Malta is deeply concerned by the escalation of violence across the Middle East. This includes the continued launching of rockets by Hezbollah and other armed groups at Israel, and the Israeli military operations beyond the Blue Line in southern Lebanon. We are also alarmed by Israeli bombardments, which are resulting in a high number of civilian casualties. This is having a dramatic impact on Lebanon and its people. Israeli military operations in Lebanon have resulted in more than 1 million Lebanese who are now displaced, while 60,000 Israelis are still unable to return home in Northern Ireland, Israel. An estimated 400,000 children are currently in need of humanitarian aid in Lebanon. Cases of forced evacuations, sometimes only at a few hours' notice, are far too numerous. Over 2,000 people have been killed, according to the Lebanese Ministry of Health, over the past 2 weeks. Israeli attacks on medical facilities, ambulances, and residential areas are wreaking havoc on the health system. Since 17 September, 16 attacks on healthcare facilities have been recorded, leaving behind 65 deaths and 40 injured among health staff. An immediate regional ceasefire is the only way to release the hostages in Gaza, de-escalate the extremely dangerous situation in Lebanon, and to ensure humanitarian aid to those in need. We must end the unbearable suffering of all civilians. President, for Lebanon, as the Secretary General said last week, one must question what remains of the framework this Council established with Resolution 1701. The path out of this crisis is clear, but the opportunity to act is rapidly narrowing. The use of weapons by non-state armed groups, including the military wing of Hezbollah, violates Security Council resolutions 1559 and 1701. Lebanese sovereignty and territorial integrity must be respected by all actors. The Lebanese state must have exclusive control of weapons throughout Lebanon. Strikes across the blue line cause the loss of civilian lives, including women and children, in addition to undermining security and exacerbating tensions. President, UNIFIL peacekeepers remain in position, and the UN flag continues to fly despite Israel's request to relocate. Recent actions show little regard for the protections afforded to UN premises and personnel under international law. This includes this morning's tank attack on a UNIFIL observation tower by the IDF, injuring 2 peacekeepers. Malta considers as unacceptable any attempt which compromises the safety of UN peacekeepers. Malta, as a troop-contributing country, stands in solidarity with all troop-contributing countries. The importance of UNIFIL's work in facilitating liaison between the parties, mitigating the risk of miscalculation, and preventing further escalation is more crucial than ever. In conclusion, no military solution will bring a future to the people of Israel, Palestine, and Lebanon. Only a political solution with the full implementation of Resolution 1701 will bring peace, security, and prosperity. Civilians on both sides of the blue line are tired and scared. Further violence and destruction will neither solve the underlying issues nor make anyone safer in the long run. A negotiated solution is the only pathway to restore the security and stability that civilians on both sides so desperately want and deserve. The time to act is now. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta and give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation. Madam President, we note France's initiative, that is the initiative to request today's meeting following the intensification of hostilities in the Republic of Lebanon, a friend of the Russian Federation. We thank USG Rosemary DiCarlo and USG Jean-Pierre Lacroix for their briefings regarding worrying developments around the border area between Lebanon and Israel. Madam President, before our very eyes, there is an unprecedented escalation of violence in the Gaza Strip, and it's stretching far beyond the limits of the Palestine-Israeli conflict, destabilizing more and more countries in the Middle East. Today, the crisis has engulfed Beirut, and the heart-rending images of the bombing of Beirut have done the rounds all over the world. We're also receiving more and more evidence of the fact that Israel harbors arrogant contempt for the opinion of the international community, the UN, and the Security Council. Israel is choosing escalation over diplomacy. The unprecedented cyber attack, as a result of which thousands of innocents suffered, this was followed by mass strikes by Israeli aviation on south and central Lebanon. Next, despite calls for a ceasefire by some members of the international community and protestations of others, the IDF on the 1st of October launched its so-called limited land operation. At the same time, Hezbollah is returning fire on Israeli territory. attacking, including sites deep within Israel, south of Haifa and near Tel Aviv. In the skies over South Lebanon, hundreds of reconnaissance and strike UAVs are operating day and night. Every hour, Israeli Air Force is conducting mass rocket and bomb strikes, targeting places where Hezbollah supposedly has deployed arms, fighters, commanders, and military and even civilian infrastructure of the Shia movement, including medical and media centers. The cynicism of these attacks is disheartening. Part of them are hitting densely populated neighborhoods in Beirut and other Lebanese cities. It would appear that West Jerusalem is not only flagrantly flouting the principles of international humanitarian law, but also viewing civilian losses as collateral damage. As we say in Russian, you can't chop wood without wood chips flying everywhere. During the 27th September bombing, as a result of which the Secretary General of Hezbollah, Mr. Nasrallah, was assassinated, 6 multi-story residential buildings and all of the people in them were reduced to a pile of rubble. Warnings addressed to the Lebanese about the need to evacuate this or that neighborhood or site are perfunctory. They cannot be executed. As a result, civilian losses are rising by the day, and civilian losses are many times greater than losses among the ranks of the Shia movement. We see no justification for further civilian victims, of which there are already several thousand. We stand in solidarity with the leadership and the people of the land of the Cedars, which has once again been subjected to Israel's military aggression, despite the fact that the land invasion of Lebanon has so far been circumscribed to a number of neighborhoods. Over 1 million people in South Lebanon have been forced to flee their homes and to become IDPs. Over 400,000 people managed to cross the border into Syria before the Israeli Air Force executed a targeted strike, destroying the road near the Masna border crossing, thereby blocking transport links between Beirut and Damascus. As far as we can tell, Israel has also conducted targeted strikes hitting UN peacekeepers. We all understand that this is a war crime and it deserves the most decisive reaction from all of us. Israel's military raids into Lebanese territory is resulting in fierce clashes with Hezbollah fighters, substantial losses on both parts, and Israeli pulling back to their initial positions. The forces are unequal. Israel has shown that it's ready to annihilate its opponent at any cost without any regard for civilian losses. In other words, the same scenario that we've seen in Gaza is now unfolding in Lebanon. Against this backdrop, the Security Council is paralyzed, and this is the US's fault. The Security Council, despite its mandate conferred by the UN Security Council, that is to maintain international peace and security, despite the fact that the Security Council has the necessary toolkit to stop the violence, is watching on silently, watching Israel's war machine systematically pushing the entire region closer to chaos. Discussions about the fate of the remaining Israeli hostages still held by Hamas have suddenly ceased, as have discussions about implementation of Security Council Resolution 2735, which endorsed, at the US's insistence, the so-called Biden deal. Our US colleagues are also less active on the Security Council. The US is nonetheless still blocking any attempts by Security Council members to adopt a decision that could help to achieve a ceasefire in the region. Israel is now going all in, despite its bitter experience of the 2006 campaign. Its U.S. accomplices are compelled to do the same, to be guided by the principle of all or nothing. And in fact, the U.S.'s actions are circumscribed by the fast-approaching election. Now, it's clear what's going on here. The only question is, what should the Security Council do under these circumstances? We don't know about colleagues, but we remain convinced that an urgent ceasefire in the Gaza Strip is the main thing the Security Council should be pursuing. It should be followed by the de-escalation of the military and political situation, both in Lebanon and in the Middle East as a whole. We unswervingly maintain that it is only by addressing this cornerstone problem, that is the Palestinian issue, that we down the line can launch the comprehensive political settlement within the international legal framework, which is known to all. That's the only way to secure a sustainable and lasting peace in the Middle East. We demand a full and comprehensive implementation of Resolution 1701, which sets out Israel's obligations, that is to cease all offensive military operations, to withdraw its armed forces from southern Lebanon, and to cease the occupation of Lebanese territory. It also contains obligations for Hezbollah to withdraw its divisions from the north of to the north of the Litani River. We fully support the UN interim force in Lebanon. We underscore the need to unswervingly ensure the security of peacekeepers, which are being subjected to unpredictable risks due to Israel's presence on the Blue Line. To tackle all of these issues, Russia stands ready to harness the entire and substantial arsenal of measures and means at the Security Council's disposal. We know what we will do, yet we're not so sure about certain colleagues on the Council. For some, they're trying to avoid putting their US ally in an uncomfortable position, and this is trumping all other considerations. The maximum that they're prepared to do is to deliver fine but empty speeches here in this chamber. Against this backdrop, on our side, we will continue making diplomatic efforts to de-escalate the situation and to prevent a catastrophic scenario for the entire Middle East. On the 3rd of October, the Russian Federation sent a humanitarian consignment to Beirut. We see many colleagues are doing the same. Nonetheless, humanitarian efforts clearly aren't enough, given that Israel and the US are pouring fuel on the flames of the most destructive escalation in the Middle East. They are impertinently violating international law and the UN Charter. And yet some, at the same time, are holding the Council hostage, having cast the veto 5 times to defend Israel's interests, and at the same time cynically ascribing the Security Council's ineffectiveness with the need to reform the Council. The Council's effectiveness is in our collective hands. It is within our reach to be effective. We can do this right now. We stand ready to work with everyone for whom the UN Charter and international law is more than empty words. I thank the representative of the Russian Federation. I will now deliver a statement in my capacity as a representative of Switzerland.
Like my colleagues, I'd like to thank France for having requested this emergency meeting, as well as Under-Secretary General De Carlo and Under-Secretary General Lacroix for their statements. Switzerland is extremely concerned about the intensification of the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah. Over the past 2 weeks, more than 1,500 people have been killed in Lebanon, including many civilians and more than 120 children. The Lebanese health system is on the verge of collapse. A large part of the country is under evacuation orders from Israel, and more than 1 million people have already been displaced, according to the Lebanese Ministry of Health. At the same time, Hezbollah continues to fire rockets into Israel, including as far as Tel Aviv. These rockets have caused deaths, injuries and damage. In addition, they continue to prevent the return of displaced persons from northern Israel. Switzerland condemns Hezbollah's attacks against Israel and its population, as well as all other violations of international law for which this group is responsible. Switzerland also condemns all violations of international law by Israel in Lebanon, in particular the airstrikes that have caused numerous civilian casualties. All hostilities must cease immediately. The sovereignty and territorial integrity of Lebanon and Israel must be respected. The inflammatory rhetoric and threats to continue hostilities are irresponsible and must also come to an end. There is no military solution to this conflict, as we've heard. This war will fan the flames of hatred on both sides and make a peaceful solution all the more difficult in the future. Switzerland calls for an immediate ceasefire. We support all efforts to reach a diplomatic solution. All parties must recommit themselves to the full implementation of Resolution 1701. This resolution is recognized by all and paves the way to resolving the underlying causes of the conflict. International humanitarian law must be respected by all parties in all circumstances. Attacks on civilians are prohibited. The parties must at all times distinguish between civilians and combatants and take all possible precautions to spare civilians, including humanitarian personnel. We recall that medical facilities and medical personnel also benefit from specific protection. It is unacceptable that many civilians, including relief workers and medical staff, have been killed. We reiterate that attacks on civilians and essential civilian infrastructure constitute war crimes, which the competent states have an obligation to investigate and to prosecute. We strongly condemn the firing by the Israeli Defense Forces on UNIFIL positions that caused injuries today. Light must be shed on these incidents and on those responsible. We expect the IDF and Hezbollah to guarantee the safety of the troops. As a contributor of troops through UNSO, Switzerland fully supports UNIFIL in the implementation of its mandate and the decision to maintain all positions. In addition, we welcome the efforts that UNIFIL and UNSCOL continue to make to deconflict, reduce tensions, and ensure liaison between the parties. We also welcome the humanitarian aid provided by UN agencies and also voluntary NGOs. Yesterday, the Swiss government announced its intention to allocate a further 7 million Swiss francs in humanitarian aid to meet the needs of the population. Excellencies, we urge all parties in the region to exercise restraint, to strictly respect international law, and to work urgently towards de-escalation. Any other behavior could lead to a regional conflagration. This Council must speak with one voice to obtain a ceasefire in Lebanon and support the parties in returning to the diplomatic track. Let us do all that we can to ensure that civilians do not continue to pay the price for the failure to find political solutions and that they can, at last, live in peace and security. I thank you. I now resume my function as President of the Council. The representative of the United States has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give you the floor.
President, and I apologize for taking the floor, and I will be very brief, but I need to respond to the comments from our Russian colleague. Russia, as I've said many times, is in no position to criticize any country, given the atrocities it is committing on a daily basis in Ukraine. It is Russia that is in clear violation of the UN Charter. In fact, it has driven a stake through the heart of the Charter. So it's important for all of us to remember that. Russia would like us to forget it. We will not. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States, and I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
We've heard, Madam President, this many times before. We're getting a sense of déjà vu. The only thing we can say to the U.S., well, we're responding to their role in the Middle Eastern crisis.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation, and I now give the floor to the representative of Lebanon.
Madam President, we thank France for requesting this session, and we thank the Presidency, Switzerland, for convening the meeting. We also thank the Under-Secretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, Ms. Di Carlo, and the Under-Secretary General for Peace Operations, Mr. Lacroix, for their briefings. Madam President, we are back to this August Council after last week's session, while the heavy bombardments are ongoing on the villages and cities of Lebanon, and while Israel is still trying to invade Lebanon. The Israeli forces have violated the internationally recognized Lebanese borders and the Blue Line. It has entered several border villages in a blatant and direct violation of the UN Charter and of Resolution 1701. This is a clear aggression against the sovereignty of an independent state and of a founding member of the United Nations. Therefore, there is a need for the Security Council to condemn this invasion and to adopt an immediate resolution to end it and to impose the withdrawal of Israel to the internationally recognized borders, which were reaffirmed by the Truce Agreement of 1949. Madam President, so far, the diplomatic endeavors have failed to impose a ceasefire, despite all the clear Lebanese messages supporting this call. The Israeli killing, destruction, and displacement machine continues to kill the Lebanese civilians and to displace 1/4 of the Lebanese population as a result of the destructive bombardments, ground invasion, and deliberate killing. The gravity of the humanitarian tragedy resulting from Israel's violation of international humanitarian law is undescribable. The number of victims have reached 2,141, most of whom died in the last 2 weeks. We add 22,000 martyrs and hundreds of injured in the massacre that happened today in one of the most densely populated areas of Beirut. Israel did not spare the civilian infrastructure in its aggression. The Israeli bombardment decommissioned several hospitals. It has cut off the Masna border crossing, which is the main border crossing between Lebanon and Syria, being used by thousands of Lebanese and Syrian displaced fleeing the horrors of aggression. Israel have bombarded the main water supply line of the Litani River, which is used to irrigate large agricultural areas. They have targeted the vicinity of the Roman archaeological site of Baalbek, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. We wonder, what is the military benefit from targeting a vital border crossing, from targeting a water station and a cultural, historical, archaeological site? We also ask, what is the goal from targeting journalists, relief workers, and medical personnel? Is this the precise surgical military operation that they have been talking about? Madam President, we thank all the brotherly and friendly countries that have been supporting Lebanon to face this humanitarian crisis. We extend to you all our thanks and appreciation. However, so far, we are far from securing all the needs to relieve the families that have been displaced because of the systematic bombardment of residential areas. The urgent call for Lebanon is only funded by 12%, although its total does not exceed $426 million. Therefore, we call upon the international community to provide urgent and sufficient support to assist us in meeting the needs. Lebanon has offered a lot as part of the efforts of the international community to address the displacement crisis in the 13 past years. Therefore, Lebanon deserves today to be supported in these difficult times. We thank France for convening an international conference in support of Lebanon on the 24th of October, and we call upon all countries to participate effectively in that conference. Madam President, bombardment, war, invasion will not provide security, safety, and stability. Only diplomatic solutions and the implementation of international resolutions, the commitment to international law and international humanitarian law is the means to end this war and this aggression. Resolution 1701 remains the ideal solution. Lebanon is fully committed to this resolution, and Lebanon renews its commitment to the French-American initiative that was announced on the 25th of September 2024 and supported by several Arab and friendly countries. This initiative calls for an immediate ceasefire for 21 days, during which we can settle outstanding border issues. Israel had agreed on that initiative before reneging it and escalating its aggression. Madam President, we reiterate our thanks to the UNIFIL operating in the south. We pay tribute to their efforts and to their sacrifices and for everything they are doing for the sake of peace in the region. We commend their stance in the face of the growing pressure by Israel. We value their decisive and courageous decisions not to surrender to the Israeli blackmail and pressure and not to withdraw from their positions. We reiterate our thanks to the 49 troop contributing countries participating in UNIFIL. We thank them for their strong commitment to maintaining international peace and security. We also condemn the Israeli attacks on their positions, and we condemn the violation of their premises and the fact that they are jeopardizing the safety and security of their facilities and members. The last of such attacks was when Israel fired today on UNIFIL positions, injuring 2 peacekeepers after a Merkava Israeli tank fired on a control tower in Nakura. This serious aggression proves that Israel does not listen, does not care about the calls of the United Nations and the United Nations Secretary General. It proves that Israel does not recognize the fears of the TCC and the concerns of the whole international community. Therefore, there is a need to protect the life of the peacekeepers and to secure their safety and the safety of their facilities. Today's aggression against the UNIFIL is condemned, and this is yet another episode to be added to Israel's long record of targeting these forces. Madam President, once again, I reiterate that the people and government of Lebanon reject the war and support an immediate ceasefire in Lebanon. Lebanon is ready for a diplomatic solution, and it is ready to facilitate the mission of the 2 American and French mediators. The Israeli side is wrong to attempt to undermine Resolution 1701 by creating a new military reality on the ground to secure unjust outcomes. Israel cannot return the displaced to their homes without an agreement. Therefore, the settlement should be just and equitable for all parties in order to be durable and lasting. Imposed unfair solutions will be partial and temporary and will be reversed at the first opportunity. Let us work together and let us spare no effort for the sake of peace and security in the Middle East. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of Lebanon, and I invite the representative of Israel to take the floor.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, USG DiCarlo and USG Lacroix, for your briefings. Madam President, this conflict began with a decision made by Hassan Nasrallah. It was Nasrallah who chose to tie his fate and that of Hezbollah with Hamas. He linked their war with the one Hamas has waged against Israel, knowing full well that it would bring suffering upon Lebanon and Israel. And this council was warned. On September 20, I stood before you and urged you to act before it was too late. I told you, and I quote, "When the time comes, do not look to us for blame in protecting our people. Now is your time to speak up and act before we have to. Your silence has forced our hand. Now, as we face the consequences of Nasrallah's decision, we must also look forward. Just as I said yesterday when we discussed the future of Gaza without a Hamas-run regime, today we must discuss the future of Lebanon, a Lebanon freed from Hezbollah's grip. The Lebanese people have suffered too long under the tyranny of this terrorist organization. We all know the ending of this conflict. Hezbollah will be pushed back north of the Litani River. But who will enforce that situation? How can we ensure it will not be ignored all over again? Who will oversee its maintenance? The answer lies in the hands of the Lebanese army and UNIFIL. They must step up. Not only must they fulfill their current duties under Resolution 1701, but we must reform those obligations. The mechanisms in place must be enhanced and altered, so we do not find ourselves back here in the same situation in another few years. Colleagues, the time has come for the Council to finally act on Resolution 1701. We have called for its full implementation for years, while warning of Hezbollah's violations. Yet our calls have gone unheeded, with some on the Council choosing to place the blame on Israel's shoulders. But it is not just Israel that requires your action. The Lebanese people, held hostage by this terror organization, need it too. Hezbollah has established a terrorist state within a failed state. Just 2 days ago, a UN Security Council report acknowledged that despite nearly 2 decades since the adoption of Resolution 1559, Hezbollah remains the most heavily armed militia in Lebanon. Their advanced weapons have robbed Lebanon of authority over its own territory. The Lebanese army, along with UNIFIL, must step up to their responsibilities and regain control. The failure to do so has led to the devastation we see now. The situation along the Blue Line remains volatile, and Israel is in close contact with UNIFIL regarding their safety. We have recommended UNIFIL forces temporarily relocate 5 kilometers north to avoid danger as fighting intensifies. While UNIFIL has chosen to stay, Israel strongly urges them to reconsider this precautionary move to protect their personnel. Let me be clear. Israel has no desire to be in southern Lebanon. Our goal is to protect our people, not to occupy Lebanese territory. But to prevent this from happening again, the Council must ensure the right mechanisms are in place for the Lebanese army and UNIFIL meet their obligations. I wish to address the Lebanese representative, Mr. Rasham. I have listened to your words and condemnations very carefully. But the truth is, you should be sitting next to me, not next to the Iranian representative. Because whether you can admit it or not, Israel, Lebanon, and the free world are on the same side against the Islamic regime of Iran. Do you not wish to see your nation once again establish its own sovereignty? Do you not wish to chart your own course rather than pay the price for Hezbollah's war? Do you not wish to see your people prosper rather than suffer at the hands of Iranian proxies? All of us should declare, shoulder to shoulder, that Iran must keep its blood-stained hands off Lebanon. Again, I listen to when you speak very carefully what you have said today and in the past, that Lebanon is for the Lebanese people, that your people and government reject war and want Resolution 1701's implementation. I could not agree more. And I would like to approach the Lebanese people. I will do it in Arabic. أتوجه للمواطنين اللبنانية.
I would like to address the Lebanese citizens and say, the land of Lebanon is for the Lebanese only, and it is not for the Iranians.
Say this, Lebanon belongs to the Lebanese, not to the Iranians. Today, the Lebanese people and their government have the perfect opportunity to throw off the yoke of Hezbollah's terrorism. Free your people from their tyranny, reclaim your sovereignty, and banish Iran's destructive influence from your borders. Colleagues, beneath the earth, hidden from the worldview, we discovered a Hezbollah tunnel that intruded into Israeli territory. This was not an isolated act. Alongside the tunnel, we found detailed maps of our northern kibbutzim, weapons and anti-tank missiles and explosive devices. They were preparing for years for a terror campaign very similar to the horrors of October 7, but we stopped them. I urge you to imagine what this council would be discussing today if we hadn't. Entire communities would have been erased, children torn from their homes. This was Hezbollah's plan. It is a plan we will continue to dismantle. Israel will continue its operations. We will degrade Hezbollah's capabilities, remove their ability to launch attacks against our people, diminish the terror network that stretches across the south of Lebanon. Our soldiers are now in the field along the border in Lebanon, exposing and dismantling Hezbollah's infrastructure. Hezbollah has brought this upon itself. And while Israel will do what it must to protect its people, this Council must do what it was created to do: ensure international peace and security. Resolution 1701 and 1559 must be enforced. We are fulfilling our obligations to ensure this, and the Council must support us in our efforts. We have over 70,000 internal refugees because of Hezbollah's rockets. 70,000 children who should be safe in their homes, playing in their backyards, learning in classrooms, are now displaced within their own country. And yet, despite the horrors, this Council stood silent as we pleaded for action. Council members, look to the future and the reality we all strive for: a future without Hezbollah terrorizing Israel and Lebanon, a sovereign Lebanon, and a future of calm. If this is the future you truly seek, there is only one path forward: implementing Resolution 1701 and 1559. Demand that the Lebanese army and UNIFIL finally fulfill their obligations and take up the tasks they are mandated to carry out. Support Israel in our necessary operations to push Hezbollah back to the Litani River. Let this be the day when you do not remain silent. Let this be the day when you stand with Israel and the Lebanese people against the forces of terror. Let this be the day you choose action over silence. I thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie le représentant.
I thank the representative of Israel. I give the floor to the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
In the name of God, the compassionate and merciful, thank you, Madam President, for convening this critical emergency meeting. We also thank the briefers for their briefing. We extend our deepest sympathy and unwavering solidarity to the government and people of Lebanon who are enduring relentless acts of aggression and war crimes, the most notorious terrorist regime in the world. The Islamic Republic of Iran stands firmly with Lebanon, fully committed to supporting its government, people, and resistance. We strongly condemn the continued complicity of the United States and certain Western states in enabling Israel's systematic war crimes and genocidal war against the people of Palestine and Lebanon through the provision of advanced weaponry. Madam President, after over a year of Israel's genocidal war in Gaza, where more than 200,000 people have been killed, injured, or left buried under the rubble, this terrorist regime has now waged a genocidal war against Lebanon, echoing its brutal campaign against the Palestinian people in Gaza. The deliberate targeting of civilians and the destruction of civilian infrastructure is far more than a violation of international law. It is a flagrant war crime and a crime against humanity and genocide. It has destroyed vital infrastructure, slaughtered innocent civilians, and driven Lebanon further into an escalating humanitarian catastrophe. Madam President, the people of Lebanon are victims of a systematic campaign of terror and violence premeditated by Israel to cripple the nation, erode its sovereignty, and inflict lasting suffering on its people. Israel is now a serious threat to international peace and security. Its ongoing aggressive acts of terror and atrocities now threaten to plunge the entire region into all-out war. The Security Council, entrusted with the responsibility of maintaining international peace and security, cannot afford to turn a blind eye to these atrocities. this Council has a moral and legal obligation to intervene. It should not allow Israeli war crime to go unchecked under the guise of self-defense or security, a justification repeatedly pushed by the representative of the United States and United Kingdom in this chamber. The unchecked impunity with which Israel continues to violate international law is a stain on our collective conscience. Madam President, with unwavering backing from the United States under the so-called ironclad support, officials of the Israeli regime are emboldened. Their heinous crimes are not only excused but actively rewarded, and their atrocities are shamelessly normalized before the world. They are counting on the United States' support in their further sinister campaign of terror and destruction. Madam President, despite the Lebanese government, including Hezbollah, agreeing to a joint 21-day temporary ceasefire proposal, Israel presently rejected it by launching a large-scale aggression on Lebanon, cruelly targeting innocent civilians. To sabotage any chance of a ceasefire, the regime assassinated Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, a prominent figure in the Islamic world and a critical factor for peace and stability in Lebanon. He was the best remaining hope for advancing the ceasefire process. This cowardly assassination served as a grim reminder of Israel's earlier abhorrent act of terror, the assassination of Mr. Ismail Haniyeh, political leader of Hamas in Tehran. That assassination shattered any hope of ceasefire for Gaza. This heinous act exposed Israel's true intention that this regime has no interest in peace or a ceasefire. Its real objective is only to provoke a full-scale war across the region. Madam President, distinguished member of the Council, Lebanon stands on the brink of humanitarian collapse, and the international community must not allow this catastrophe to worsen. It is imperative that humanitarian aid flows unimpeded to the Lebanon. The international community must provide immediate financial and logistic support to ensure the essential supplies reach to the affected population. The very credibility of the Council is at stake. We demand immediate action. We call for an immediate ceasefire. The ceasefire is not a request, but a necessity. Further, we urge the Council to hold accountable Israel for committing such genocidal war and atrocities against the people of Lebanon and Palestine. This Council must send an unequivocal message. The ongoing Israeli occupation and aggression must end. Israel must fully implement Resolution 1701. A just resolution to the crisis requires the recognition of Lebanon's sovereignty and independence, the end of Israel's illegal occupation and aggression, and respect for international law and the UN Charter. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Iran. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, head of the delegation of the EU to the United Nations. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Madam President. The Middle East is on the verge of a complete conflagration, and the people in the region are more insecure than ever, caught in an unending cycle of violence, hatred, and revenge. More than 1 year after the brutal terrorist attack of Hamas on Israel, we reiterate our call for the full implementation of all UN Security Council resolutions, including 2735, which would lead to an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, the release of all hostages, a significant and sustained increase in the flow of humanitarian assistance throughout Gaza, and an enduring ceasefire and end to the crisis, with Israel's security interests and safety for Palestinians, civilians assured. We deplore all loss of civilian lives and note with utmost concern the unacceptable number of civilian casualties, especially children, as well as the catastrophic levels of hunger and imminent risk of famine caused by the insufficient entry of aid into Gaza. In exercising its right to defend itself, Israel must fully comply with its obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law, in all circumstances. No military solution will bring a lasting peaceful future to the people of Israel and Palestine. Only a political one based on the two-state solution with the State of Israel and an independent, democratic, contiguous, sovereign and viable State of Palestine living side by side in peace, security and mutual recognition. Just 2 weeks ago, Madam President, in New York, the European Union, Saudi Arabia and Norway, as co-chairs, launched the Global Alliance on this two-state solution, which rallied a significant number of UN members. The conflict has now extended to Lebanon, with a dangerous cycle of attacks and retaliations, which is only fueling the logic of war in the region. The EU urges all parties to exercise utmost restraint. The territorial integrity and sovereignty of Lebanon must be respected by all parties. Hezbollah's unprovoked firing of rockets and other projectiles into Israeli territory has to stop now. We also strongly condemn the launch of missiles from Iran against Israel. At the same time, we are deeply concerned and alarmed by Israel's strikes in densely populated areas in Lebanon, which have caused a high number of civilian casualties, including women and children, and humanitarian personnel, and the destruction of civilian infrastructure. Madam President, more than 1 million Lebanese are now displaced. More than 200,000 try to seek refuge in war-torn Syria, and 60,000 Israelis are unable to return home in northern Israel. We especially deplore the heavy price paid by civilians. Humanitarian assistance must continue to reach those in need unimpededly and at scale. Its safe delivery must be possible at any time. We call for de-escalation and on both parties to immediately implement a ceasefire across the blue line and to work towards the full implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 1701 in order to ensure the safe return of displaced populations on both sides. We reiterate a strong support for the efforts of France and the United States to achieve a negotiated ceasefire. Madam President, we condemned as well the attacks on UNIFIL peacekeepers on 10 October and all attacks on UN peacekeepers, which is a grave violation of international humanitarian law and of Security Council Resolution 1701. We reaffirm our full support to UNIFIL, in which we have a strong EU presence. In the current situation of emergency, UNIFIL assumes a fundamental stabilization role in South Lebanon. We urge all parties to respect UNIFIL's presence and to fully uphold their obligations to guarantee the safety and security of UNIFIL personnel at all times. The European Union strongly supports the state institutions of Lebanon, including the Lebanese armed forces, which are a key element for the full implementation of 1701. The EU stands ready to help Lebanon to get out of its political impasse. A few days ago, the European Union adopted assistance measures under the European Peace Facility worth €15 million to support the Lebanese armed forces, which brings the total support to €21 million. We also announced a further €40 million in humanitarian aid to help those most in need in Lebanon, bringing our humanitarian assistance to the country to €104 million this year alone. Lastly, we have also launched a humanitarian bridge from Cyprus to support people affected by the ongoing situation in Lebanon. EU member states also count bilaterally among the largest humanitarian donors worldwide. Madam President, essential steps for stabilization now include the deployment of the Lebanese army in the south, ensuring that UNIFIL can fulfill its mandate, and organizing an urgent humanitarian conference. In this regard, we welcome the announcement by France of a conference in support of Lebanon. In closing, the European Union will continue to work tirelessly to pave the way for diplomacy and de-escalate an extremely dangerous situation for the region. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Mr. Lambrinidis. I'd now like to give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I will start my statement whereof my colleague from the Palestine stopped yesterday, as he said that the Israeli occupation authorities do not listen to your counsel. They continue to flout the United Nations and international law. They continue to commit acts of aggression and brutality and continue to shed the blood of innocent civilians. This barbaric Israeli conduct, the expansion of the scope of its aggression to Lebanon, and the intensification of its attacks on Syrian territory and other states in the region are the result of the occupation's authorities' certainty that there are those in this council who prevent it from carrying out its mandate and taking any effective steps to stop the aggression and put an end to the Israeli crimes. The inaction and the filibustering in the council in dealing with Gaza might be repeated in the case of Lebanon. This should not be allowed to happen. It's unacceptable. It's even shameful that some in this council who have been championing rights, human rights, do not see anything wrong with the violations by Israeli occupation authorities of the principles and purposes of the Charter and the provisions of international law. They even distort facts to make the criminal a victim and the relentless aggression an act of self-defense, legitimate self-defense. They do not shy off from providing all forms of support to empower the occupation entity to continue with its aggression and brutality, threatening regional and international peace and security in the region and beyond. Madam President, at a time when the vast majority of member states have condemned the war of genocide and aggression committed by the occupation authorities in Gaza, the war criminals in the occupying entity are publicly threatening to make Lebanon another Gaza. Therefore, your council is required today not to only count the days of the aggression or the numbers of casualties. It is required to take immediate and meaningful action to end the barbaric Israeli attack on Lebanon, the attack that targeted thousands of innocent civilians, journalists, humanitarian and healthcare personnel, and spread death and destruction in entire areas. It flattened buildings and residential neighborhoods. It displaced hundreds of thousands of their residents in their homeland, Lebanon, and into my country, Syria. The deliberate targeting of Israel, by Israel, of civilians, and the massive use of heavy weapons and bombs, and the assassinations and the use of these bombs in the most densely populated cities, and the calls by the officials of the occupying authorities for mass killing, and the use of prohibited weapons, including those of mass destruction, clearly reflects the aggressive nature of the occupation and its military practices, which have destabilized the security and the stability of the region for decades and prevented its peoples from living in an atmosphere of prosperity and stability. Madam President, simultaneous to the escalation of the Israeli aggression on Lebanon, the Israeli occupation authorities have intensified their attacks on the Syrian territory until they have become almost a daily affair. During the past few days, they have hit a number of residential buildings in the capital, Damascus, resulting in the death of 15 civilians, most of them women and children, and the injury of dozens more, not to mention the intimidation and the terrorization of peaceful civilians, and the material losses and damages to private and public property. These Israeli attacks also targeted the international road linking Damascus and Beirut, which is used daily by thousands of people coming from the brotherly Lebanon to escape the killing machine of Israel, which inflicted further suffering on them that exacerbated their humanitarian suffering due to the displacement. Israel also attacked commercial facilities and a hub for the collection of food and medical aid for those arriving from Lebanon in the industrial city of Hezbollah. My country, Syria, while stressing its right to defend its territorial integrity by all means guaranteed by international law, calls on the Security Council to take immediate action to stop such attacks and to ensure the accountability and their non-recurrence. Madam President, my country, Syria, reiterates its strong solidarity with the brotherly Lebanon, which is facing an emergency humanitarian tragedy due to the Israeli aggression. Despite the challenges it faces and the inhumane unilateral coercive measures, the Syrian government has taken all necessary measures to provide humanitarian assistance to all Lebanese coming to Syria. The Syrians, Lebanese, and nationals of third countries, whose numbers exceeded 350,000, including almost 100,000 Lebanese and thousands of Arab and foreign persons. The High Relief Committee issued the necessary documents and provided all facilities for their entry and assistance, including the establishment of humanitarian response centers on border crossings in cooperation with the UNHCR, the Syrian Red Crescent, and Syrian NGOs. The government equipped shelters to host them. That's in addition to the homes of Syrians who opened their doors to host their brothers. We are also providing health care and medical services to more than 20,000 to date. We are also providing food baskets, non-food humanitarian aid, transport and communication, legal consultation, official documents, customs exemptions, and other basic services, all free of charge. Syria looks forward to the response by the member states of the UN to the relevant appeals launched by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and other UN agencies. Madam President, Syria stresses the need for the Council to take decisive and unequivocal action and to adopt a clear and obvious resolution that cannot be misinterpreted or used as filibustering, as we have seen in the past. A resolution that obliges the Israeli occupation authorities to cease their aggression against Palestine and Lebanon and Syria, to curb the efforts of the occupation to invade the Lebanese territory, as this represents a flagrant violation to the Lebanese sovereignty, its unity, and territorial integrity, and a grave threat to its security and stability. My country also stresses the need to hold Israel accountable and ensure it does not enjoy impunity. We call to enforce relevant Security Council resolutions, in particular resolutions 242, 338, and 497. In doing so, the Council will be discharging its main mandate given to it by member states to maintain international peace and security. In conclusion, Madam President, the attempts by the occupation to break the will of the peoples of the region and push them to abandon their inherent rights to resist the occupation and restore their occupied land will not succeed. Facts of history prove that. The owners of the land will eventually prevail, regardless of the length and the brutality of the crimes of occupation. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the Syrian Arab Republic. I give the floor to the representative of Indonesia.
Thank you, Madam President. It is indeed a gloomy day for multilateralism when the very symbol of international peace, the blue helmets, are under direct attack. Israel has made yet another breach to UN Charter, another affront to international law and international humanitarian law through its direct attacks against UN peacekeepers. The IDF's indiscriminate attacks against UNIFIL, which wounded 2 of our peacekeepers, clearly demonstrates how Israel positioned itself above international law, above impunity, and above our shared values of peace. We strongly condemn this violation. The lack of any apparent moral compass by Israel is indeed appalling. Against this backdrop, Indonesia wishes to highlight 3 points. First, Israel's actions against UNIFIL represent a blatant attempt to spreading terror on the ground, to intimidate both the peacekeeping mission and the international community. This is unacceptable. And let me be clear, those who stand by the cause of peace will never be afraid of bullies and perpetrators of genocide. We remind the Israeli forces and all actors of their obligations to ensure full protection of UNIFIL personnel and UN properties. Second, Israel's ongoing defiance of international law demands immediate action. The attacks came amidst a broader pattern of violations of UN Security Council Resolution 1701 by Israel. This includes repeated incursions into Lebanese territory, violating Lebanese sovereignty and territorial integrity. As clearly recorded in the UN Secretary General's report on the implementation of the resolution, from February to June alone, 1,551 air violations were launched by the IDF. The persistence of these violations of international law without any meaningful consequences is a matter of serious concern, undermining the credibility of international legal order and undermining the credibility of this very council. Third, as UNIFIL's largest troop contributor, Indonesia underlines our firm and full support to UNIFIL and UN peacekeeping. Indonesia pays tribute to all UN peacekeepers serving on the ground. We honor their bravery and dedication to the cause of peace. Despite the outrageous attacks, Indonesia remains firmly committed to working with the UN, the UNIFIL force commander, and the international community to ensure the success of UNIFIL mission. De-escalation efforts and the prospect for lasting peace in the region hinge upon UNIFIL's ability to fully implement its mandate. The Council must act decisively to ensure that UNIFIL can continue its vital work in southern Lebanon, upholding the high standards of conduct while ensuring the safety and security of UN peacekeepers. Excellency, the Indonesian Constitution mandates all Indonesians to contribute to a world order based on freedom, lasting peace, and social justice. And this is why Indonesia is a firm supporter to UN peacekeeping and proudly stand as the 5th largest troops and police contributing country. Their mandates derive from the Security Council. Let me therefore ask the Council the following. Our peacekeepers have delivered on their mandates. Please make sure the Council also delivers on yours. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Indonesia, and I give the floor to the representative of Mauritania. Madam President, Allow me at the outset to thank France for having convened this meeting. I would also like to thank Madame Rosemary DiCarlo, Under Secretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, as well as Monsieur Jean-Pierre Lacroix, Under Secretary General for Peace Operations. I thank them both for their briefings with regard to developments on the ground in the context of this aggression against the Sisterly Republic of Lebanon. I pronounce this statement on behalf of the Arab group. Israel, since the 1st of October, is leading a land invasion at scale in Lebanon in serious violation of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Lebanon, as well as the Charter of the United Nations and Resolution 1701. This resolution has worsened the humanitarian crisis, particularly following the violent attacks against villages in the Dalbaka region in the south of Lebanon and in the southern suburbs of Beirut. The Israeli army has carried out more than 10,000 raids, in fact, leading to several massacres, 2,200 victims, civilian victims in the last few days, amongst them hundreds of children and women. 10,000 other people have been wounded and 2 million people have been displaced, including 400,000 children. Madam President, the Israeli aggression is just like what's happening in the Gaza Strip. Medical and humanitarian workers and United Nations staff and journalists have been attacked. Hospitals and places of worship have been attacked by using the heaviest kinds of weapons in clear violation and repeated violation of the principles of international law. The Arab group reiterates its solidarity with Lebanon, a brotherly nation, in the face of this ongoing and unjustified aggression, and we call upon this august council as well as the entire international community to fully assume their responsibilities and to put an end to this persistent systematic aggression and this dismissal of international peace and security, disregard for it. We will pursue efforts in order to put an end to these aggressions and attacks against civilians that are defenseless in Lebanon and the attack against the sovereignty and territorial integrity of this country that is dear to us through the implementation principally of Resolution 1701. We call upon all member states to answer the urgent call issued by the United Nations to assist those that have been displaced. And here we welcome the role played by the United Nations on the ground, particularly through organizations for rescue and humanitarian assistance through UNIFIL. And we condemn the attack that took place today. And in conclusion, we call for a continuation of our work in order to avoid a humanitarian and political disaster with serious consequences. We also have to continue to ensure that we put an end to the war in Gaza and prevent its spread. I thank you, Madam President. I thank the representative of Mauritania. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I now invite council members to informal consultations to continue our discussion on the subject. The meeting is adjourned.